I had always imagined what it would be like to come back home. It seemed like it would be a moment when I would feel the warmth of comfort, the smell of freshly baked goods, and the light bustle that is characteristic of familiar walls. But reality turned out to be different. When I drove up to the house, the first thing I noticed was the silence. There was no familiar hum that used to fill the kitchen when Grandma was cooking, and not even the light noise from the old television that always stood in the corner. It felt as if everything in the house had come to a standstill. I walked across the porch, and my steps echoed with a dull sound, breaking the strange silence. A thought flashed through my mind. Perhaps I had been away for so long that everything seemed changed. I entered the house. Everything was in its place. The same old shelves where our family photos had been since my childhood. The bench by the window where Mom loved to sit with a book. But now, everything looked as if it were covered by a layer of dust. Not worn, but as if left behind for some other time. I felt a strange, heavy sensation that I couldn't quite explain at that moment. Mom? Dad? I went to the kitchen, hoping to see them as in the good old days. But instead, I ran into Josh. My brother was sitting on the floor, slowly picking up the broken pieces of a cup. His face was tense. His eyes didn't meet mine. He said something like, "Hello," in a strangely loud voice, as if he was trying to hide something I wasn't supposed to know. We exchanged a few phrases, but between us, at that moment, there was a shadow. Something that hadn't been there before. I felt the air in the house had changed. He stood up, putting the shards of the cup aside, and hurried to leave. I stood there in the kitchen, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Mom and Dad had gone somewhere on business, and the house was engulfed by an even greater silence. I tried to do something to fill it. I turned on the radio, then turned it off again, sat at the table, but everything around me felt so foreign. I searched for a reason to talk to Josh, but he kept going into his room, hiding from me as if he was hiding something. When I entered his room, he was sitting by the window, staring into the darkness. I noticed that his gaze was empty, as if he was seeing something that wasn't there. I couldn't understand what was happening with him. There was something alien in his behavior, something new and frightening. We had always been close, but now I felt as though I were standing behind glass, and that glass separated us. "Are you hiding something from me?" I asked, unable to hide the concern in my voice. He looked at me and something flickered in his eyes that I couldn't decipher. He turned away and quietly said, "It's fine." But I didn't believe him. The words were too loud, and there was too much uncertainty in what he said. I tried to convince him to tell me what was going on, but he just fell silent and went back to his room, as though I were the intruder. The silence in the house was becoming unbearable. It felt like I couldn't shake the sense that something was being kept from me. Josh, he had always been open, someone you could always talk to. But now, I couldn't understand what exactly had changed. The next day, the house became even quieter. Mom and Dad had gone away for a few days, leaving Josh and me alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a sense of unease hanging in the air. It permeated every room, and I could feel it growing stronger as it pressed in on me. I tried to talk to him, but Josh seemed like he was in another world. He barely left his room, and when I knocked to check how he was doing, he just opened the door a crack and said, "It's fine. I need to be alone for a while." It was strange. I didn't remember him ever behaving like this before. We had always been able to talk, share our thoughts, discuss problems. But now, I couldn't understand what was happening with him. He didn't want to open up. He didn't want to share. I stood on his doorstep, not knowing what to do. In moments of anxiety, we had always found comfort in talking to each other, but now there was something insurmountable between us. It was as though he wanted to shut himself off in his own world, and it filled me with unease. That evening, I tried again to talk to him. I sat beside him on his bed, trying to start a conversation about how I missed home, how I missed the family. But he didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on a spot on the wall, and his hands nervously gripped his phone. "Josh, don't you want to talk?" I asked, this time quietly, hoping he would respond. He sighed but didn't answer. I felt how, with every word between us, an invisible wall was growing, a wall I couldn't break down. That evening, I stayed in my room, trying to understand what was going on. Everything looked like nothing had changed, but I felt that this silence, this coldness from him, was the beginning of something big and unsettling that I still had to understand. The silence in the house was becoming deeper, and with every passing hour, it seemed more and more unreal. I tried to drown it out with something, but nothing helped. Even the familiar sounds, the creak of the floor, the rustle of the wind outside the windows, suddenly became sharp and annoying. I sat in my room, trying to collect my thoughts, but my mind was filled with questions that had no answers. What's happening with Josh? Why has he changed so much? I decided to walk through the house, hoping to dispel this strange heaviness, but as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I heard him close his room door. He had secluded himself again. I stopped by his door, listening, but there were no sounds, just emptiness. This wasn't an ordinary silence, it was something else. Something I could call a void, filling the space and leaving a mark in it. I walked up to his room and tried the door handle. It was locked. The feeling that I was drifting farther away from my brother only grew stronger. And with every passing moment, it became harder for me to understand what was really happening to him. I felt a rising anxiety inside me, but I couldn't find the strength to knock on his door again. At that moment, I realized the house had become foreign. It looked the same as it always had, but the emptiness felt so deep that it was hard to believe this place had ever been my home. All that remained were strange sounds that I couldn't explain. Sometimes it seemed like I heard his footsteps in the hallway, and other times, just the echo of my own loneliness. I returned to my room and sat on the bed. But instead of calming down, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that I was losing touch with reality. Josh. He was here, but he wasn't. And every hour spent in this house only confirmed my suspicions. Something was truly wrong. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. I had to find out what was happening with him before this emptiness consumed both of us. In the evening, when the house had once again fallen into silence, I suddenly heard quiet talking coming from Josh's room. It was strange because he always closed the door when he talked on the phone, and I wouldn't have been able to hear his voice unless I really listened. At first, I thought it was just one of his friends, but something in the tone was different. He spoke loudly, overly confidently, as if he wanted to be heard. But between his words, there was something unsettling that I couldn't understand. I slowly approached his door, pressing my ear to the cold wood, trying to catch the details. He was emotional. Sometimes his voice trembled, and at other times it became almost accusing. I felt my heart beat faster. Who could be talking to him like that? And why didn't I know about this person? Just as I was about to enter, the door suddenly opened, and Josh was standing right in front of me. His face was tense, and his eyes avoided mine. "Are you out of your mind?" His voice was insistent, even sharp. "I heard you. You were talking to someone. Who was it?" I tried to keep my tone soft, but deep down, my questions gnawed at me. He quickly stepped back, as if trying to hide. "Nothing important. It's just, well, you know." I don't know. I couldn't hold back my curiosity anymore. "Don't you want to talk to me? Why have you become like this?" He fell silent, and I saw his shoulders tighten, as if he were ready to close off from me at any moment. "It's fine," he said, but his words sounded hollow, as if they had nothing to do with the present. He didn't let me continue the conversation, quickly retreating to his room and closing the door behind him. I stood in the hallway, feeling how the misunderstanding between us grew. We had always talked about such things before, but now, something had clearly changed. I couldn't understand what it was. I returned to my room, feeling the anxiety continuing to grow inside me. He was hiding something. I was sure of it. And whatever it was much bigger than just personal problems. The next morning, I decided to talk to Josh again. I couldn't stay in this uncertain state any longer, where everything around me felt like a veil hiding something important. I didn't understand what was happening with my brother, and every moment of his silence only deepened the chasm between us. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table, sipping his coffee. I sat across from him, trying to speak calmly, but inside I was a storm of emotions. I wanted to understand what was going on, but as always, the words didn't come. He looked up when I sat down, but quickly averted his gaze. "Do you want to talk after all?" I began, feeling the heavy weight of anxiety pressing on my chest. "What's going on with you, Josh? Why do you keep shutting me out? Why won't you share anything?" He set down his cup, and I noticed how his hands clenched into fists. He looked at me, but his gaze was cold and distant. "Nothing's going on," he said, and added with a strange fatigue in his voice, "Just stop worrying." "I can't just stop worrying, Josh. You're important to me." I felt my voice tremble, and my eyes almost couldn't hold back the tears. "We've always talked about everything. You can't just shut me out like this." He was silent for a few seconds, and I thought he was trying to find the words to explain, but something was holding him back. Finally, he quietly said, "Just let me go. I don't want to talk about it right now." Those words pierced me like a knife. I couldn't understand what was happening with my brother. He had always been the one I could rely on, and now the person sitting in front of me was almost a stranger. I tried again, but he stood up, not letting me continue. I said, "Don't." He quickly walked away to his room, and I was left in the kitchen, feeling how that invisible wall between us grew thicker and stronger. All I could do was sit there and agonize because understanding what was happening with him seemed impossible. I knew he was hiding something from me, but each of his silences and every gesture only made me feel more helpless. What's happening with him? And how can I help if he won't even talk to me? The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the town. I needed a break from all the tension and to try and figure things out for myself. I stepped outside, and as soon as I noticed the familiar places, I felt a slight relief. Time here seemed to slow down, and I returned to my usual role: daughter, sister, the person who knew this town. But it felt like all of that was in the past. I walked through the park, not in a hurry, when I suddenly saw Josh. He was sitting on one of the benches, his head lowered, talking to a woman I didn't recognize. I immediately felt that something was off. The way he was speaking to her was different. His usually confident manner was somehow softer, but his eyes had an odd wariness, and her tone, it left an unpleasant feeling. The woman was saying something, leaning toward him, her words soft but clear. At one point, she said something that made me feel like I was an outsider here. I couldn't make out what they were talking about, but her voice was cold, distant, and her face was serious. I don't know why, but I felt a growing anxiety inside me. There was something in her behavior that made me feel like I was watching something I shouldn't be seeing. I froze in place, unsure whether to approach, but unable to tear my gaze away. When Josh noticed me, his face immediately changed. He stood up, nodded briefly, and said something to the woman. She responded, and they quickly parted ways. I stood there as if in a daze, not knowing what to do. I didn't know this woman, but her presence left a heavy aftertaste. Josh, noticing me, quickly hurried off without looking back. Everything in his behavior seemed foreign, distant, and I couldn't understand why he didn't want to talk to me about her. I continued my walk through the park, but I couldn't shake that strange feeling. I kept thinking about her voice, about how Josh avoided my gaze. Why had he distanced himself so much? Who was she? And why did he go to such lengths to hide her from me? As I headed home, I felt like something was happening that I couldn't quite grasp. This encounter felt like a sign that my worries weren't baseless and that another chasm was growing between me and my brother. A few more days passed, and the situation grew even more mysterious. Josh continued to avoid me, and his strange behavior only intensified. I tried to understand what was happening, but everything remained like a fog. Gray, unclear, filled with unsaid things and silence. It was as if he had retreated into his shell and I couldn't find him there. Every morning I tried to talk to him, asking what was bothering him, but he brushed me off. his answers short and lifeless. It felt like I could no longer reach him, that our conversations had become empty, like echoes. Everything I tried to understand was hidden from me, and I felt the chasm between us growing. Every day I watched his behavior, looking for signs that he might decide to talk. But he didn't change. When he was home, he was almost invisible, hiding in his room, and if he did appear, he would try to avoid my gaze. His eyes no longer met mine, and even his voice sounded different. Tired, distant. I began to feel that I was left alone, that in this house I didn't belong to anyone. Everything around me was becoming foreign, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was unbearable to see him like this, as if he had become part of this invisible world where I couldn't find a place. I felt like I needed to find a way to understand what was happening to him, to understand what was hidden behind this silence. But all I could do was wait, hoping that someday he would decide he was ready to share his pain with me. One day, sitting in my room, I noticed that an old notebook was lying on his bed. It was the one we used to share for our school notes, the one I hadn't seen in years. The cover had subtle signs of time, and inside, his writings. I froze, staring at it. What if this was the key to understanding what was going on with him? What if these words would help me understand what was hidden in his soul? With doubt, but with hope, I picked up the notebook and began to read. Page after page, I delved deeper into his writings. At first, the words seemed so simple, barely noticeable, about school, friends, small everyday things we once discussed together. But soon, his handwriting became a jumbled mess of inexpressible emotions. He wrote about events he couldn't tell me, about complicated feelings he couldn't put into words. I felt the anxiety inside me growing, along with an overwhelming sense of pity. He couldn't open up, couldn't share his pain with me, even though I had always been there. And now, flipping through these pages, I was getting to know him through the eyes he had hidden for so long. He wrote about a girl he had issues with, about his fears, doubts, and worries that he thought were too heavy to speak about. He shared what tormented him at night, but he couldn't say these words out loud. On one of the pages, I found an honest confession. I can't figure myself out. Everything is going wrong, and I don't know how to fix it. She doesn't understand me, and I can't understand her. It feels like I'm losing control of myself. I stopped, feeling a heavy emotion wash over me. I never knew he was struggling so much with his relationship. He had always seemed so confident, so strong, and suddenly it turned out that behind this mask was a guy who was lost and confused. With every page, I understood that my suspicions about his silence were correct. He had been hiding his deepest struggles from me, and I had been blind to it. But what truly shook me was that I hadn't been there for him when he needed it most. I wanted so badly to help, but I had never considered that his silence wasn't just distancing himself, but a desperate attempt to cope with something too big for him to handle. I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I felt that if I didn't step in now, I might lose him forever. I had to talk to him. I had to make a move, despite all his withdrawal. But I lacked the courage. What if he didn't want to talk? What if his pain was too deep for me to understand? I knew it was time to act. After reading his writings, I finally understood what lay behind his strange behavior. It wasn't just dissatisfaction or typical teenage problems. It was something much deeper, his relationship with the girl he couldn't find common ground with. And now, when I had figured it all out, I felt the need to approach him, despite all his attempts to avoid communication. I waited for him to come into a shared space, the kitchen, the living room, somewhere we could talk in peace, without hurry, without pressure. I didn't know how to begin, but I knew that if I didn't try, I would be stuck in this vicious circle again, where he would remain alone and I would desperately try to understand him. When Josh finally left his room, I approached him, not paying attention to his wariness. I felt each step bringing me closer to a moment that might change everything. "Josh," I said, his name softly, almost as a whisper, as if afraid to break the fragility of the moment. He turned toward me, and I saw how he once again avoided my gaze. I didn't know how to begin, but I couldn't remain silent. I know you're having problems with the girl. You don't have to hide it from me. He looked at me with unexpected surprise, and there was something like confusion on his face. His gaze softened but was still tense. He took a step back, holding himself back. You shouldn't get into my business, he said quietly, but there was pain in his voice, hidden beneath a layer of detachment. Josh, I'm your sister. My words came out before I could stop them. You can trust me. You're not alone. He fell silent. It was a heavy silence in which I could feel his emotional pain weighing on him. He didn't know what to do, how to accept my help. It seemed like his inner world was falling apart, and he didn't know how to put it back together. I can't, he finally said, his voice trembling. I don't know what to do. I don't want to disappoint you. Those words hit me like a blow. I knew he had always been strong, that he had always been the one supporting me, not the other way around. And now, hearing those words, it hurt to realize that he felt weak and lost. I stepped closer to him, not letting the distance grow between us. You won't disappoint me, I said, trying to infuse my words with all the warmth and support I felt. You're not alone. We're with you, Josh. In his eyes, I saw tears, but he quickly turned away, as always hiding his emotions. But in that moment, I knew. He was ready to take a step toward me. I didn't want to pressure him, but I understood that now it was my duty to be there, to support him, even if he wasn't ready to fully open up. We stood in silence, and in that silence was not only pain, but also hope. I didn't know what he would say next, but now I believed that our relationship could become what it once was. The next day, when I woke up, the house was as quiet as ever. Mom and Dad still hadn't returned, and once again, I found myself alone with Josh. We didn't speak much, but there was something new in his behavior. He was a little less closed off, and although his eyes still avoided mine, they no longer carried the same detachment I had noticed before. We hadn't made all the steps toward complete reconciliation, but something had changed in our communication, and that was enough for me. After lunch, when the sun started to set, I suggested we go to the old lookout point, the one we used to visit often when we were kids. It was a place where we felt safe, where we could sit together and simply watch the city without needing words. I didn't know what exactly prompted me to suggest it, but I felt like there, we would be able to talk. We sat on the old bench just like we used to, and for a while we remained silent. From time to time, Josh glanced at me, but he didn't start the conversation. I didn't rush him. He had opened up to me sooner than I had expected, and I didn't want to push him. But it seemed that these silent moments were necessary for us to work through everything we had been through. I don't know how to fix everything, he finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. She just doesn't understand. I lost myself in this relationship. I listened to him, and my heart filled with compassion. This was so hard for him, but now I saw how deeply he wanted to find a way out. He, like me, was tangled up in his feelings, afraid to make the wrong move, to lose the one he loved, and at the same time, to lose himself. You don't have to be perfect, Josh, I said, feeling tears welling in my eyes. We all make mistakes. You don't have to solve everything on your own. If you need time, I'm here. He was silent for a while, and I could feel the tension between us fading. It wasn't just a conversation. It was true understanding. He finally relaxed, and I felt with every word he spoke that the cold wall that had been between us was disappearing. You're right, he finally replied. I thought I had to do everything by myself. But now I realize I need more than just silence. I need to be honest and not be afraid to admit that I'm wrong. We sat there watching the sunset. The sun's rays played on the horizon, and the air was warm, just like it had been when we were kids, unaware of pain or loss. And in that silence, filled with understanding, I knew that our connection had been restored. There was no clear resolution, no final conclusions, but we were there for each other, and that was enough. We didn't return home right away. We simply sat together, feeling that our relationship could be as it once was. And even though there were still many questions and difficult moments ahead, I knew we were no longer alone in each other. After our meeting at the lookout point, I felt a weight lift from my heart. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that everything would get better, I knew there were still many unresolved issues between Josh and me. We had just begun to open up to each other, but that wasn't enough to fix everything. Time, pain, and silence had ruled our relationship for too long, and I knew we had a lot of work ahead of us to become who we once were. Josh started to change. He began spending less time locked away in his room, though he remained warm yet cautious. We often sat at the table discussing things, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about small things. But sometimes the same shadow would flicker in his eyes again, something I couldn't pull out of him. I could feel that he was hiding something, but now I didn't ask too many questions. I already knew. He would open up when he was ready. All I had to do was be there. A few days later, when I was sitting in the kitchen, he came to me, approached, and sat next to me. It was so unexpected that I was a little taken aback. He remained silent for a long time, and then finally spoke. "I think I need to talk to her," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't hide anymore. I can't keep living in this worry with these unresolved issues. I need to figure out what to do." I looked at him, and there was something resolute in his words. But I also knew that this decision wouldn't be easy. Conversations about feelings are always difficult, especially when you don't know what awaits you on the other side. I felt the same anxiety growing inside me again. What if he makes a mistake again? What if it gets worse? "You're not alone," I said quietly, my voice sounding confident. "Don't worry, we'll get through this together." He nodded, but in his eyes I saw the same uncertainty as before. He still wasn't ready to make a decision that could change everything. I understood that this would be a long road, and although his words sounded determined, they didn't mean he had found his answer yet. In these moments, I realized that there wouldn't be just one meeting at the lookout point. We still had a long way to go, and it wouldn't always be easy. But I believed that we could overcome everything. Together. Several weeks passed. Josh really did start talking to the girl he had problems with. I saw how every day his gaze became a little more determined and his behavior calmer. He was beginning to return to his former confidence, although he still remained cautious, like someone not yet ready to fully open up. It was noticeable, but I knew this wasn't a process that could be rushed. We began spending time together again, and although there was still an invisible barrier between us, I felt that his silence no longer held me in fear. He didn't close himself off from me like before, and although not everything was back to where it should be, his decision to act was starting to bear fruit. One evening, when we were sitting together in the kitchen, he suddenly turned to me. "I talked to her," he said, and there was no trace of the usual anxiety in his voice. "She understands everything. We've decided that we need some time apart to figure out our feelings. Maybe it's not the final decision, but at least now I know for sure what I need." I looked at him, and in his eyes there was no trace of the confusion I had seen before. It was as if he had shed a heavy burden he had been carrying for so long. "Are you proud of yourself?" I asked, trying to understand what he was feeling. He smiled, but it was a weak yet genuine smile. "I don't know, but I feel lighter. It's the first step, and now I can focus on myself, on what really matters." I nodded. There was something reassuring in his words. He was ready not only to deal with the situation, but also to admit that he needed to focus on himself. It was a huge step forward, and I was proud of him, even though the road ahead was still difficult. "You've made a big step," I said, and my voice was sincere. "You don't have to solve everything right away. But you're not alone, Josh. We're all in this together. I believe you'll find your way." He nodded quietly and picked up his cup of tea. But in his eyes, I saw something more. Not just relief, but hope. It was the kind of hope we hadn't felt in a long time. In that moment, I realized that although our relationship wasn't fully restored yet, we had begun to build bridges again. We had once again become the kind of people for each other with whom we could walk through life. Our connection was alive, And I knew that despite all the challenges, this journey would only strengthen us. I couldn't predict what would happen next, but one thing was clear. We had started moving forward. And that was an important step for both of us.